Hello, my name is Min Jung Kim, and I'm the Director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art. Thank you for joining me for this very special lecture presented by Connecticut-based artist Bob Gregson, who will share his research on the remarkable work and lives of Josef and Anni Albers, two of the most visionary artists of the 20th century. Tonight's lecture is held in conjunction with the New Britain Museum of American Art's exhibition, In Thread and on Paper, Anni Albers in Connecticut, curated by Fritz Hortzman and organized in collaboration with the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation. This landmark presentation is the first museum exhibition devoted to Anni Albers' diverse output during her 44 years in Connecticut. It is also the artist's first major solo exhibition at a U.S. museum in over 20 years. I hope you were able to listen in on a fascinating related lecture by Fritz Hortzman earlier this week, presented by the Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut, which will also be featuring the work of Anni Albers in a special exhibition this year. The New Britain Museum of American Art's exhibition, In Thread and on Paper, is made possible by the support of the Kobe Foundation Limited. We would also like to extend our profound gratitude to the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation for their generous collaboration, and to the exhibition curator Fritz Hortzman for conceiving this important presentation of Anni's work. In Thread and on Paper is part of 2020 20 Plus Women at the NBMAA, a special initiative in honor of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in America, featuring a year-long series of groundbreaking exhibitions devoted exclusively to women artists. All throughout this year, and likely into next, we will be showcasing special exhibitions and permanent collection reinstallations to bring greater diversity and representation of women in our galleries. The 2020 20 Plus Women's Initiative is made possible by the generous support of our presenting sponsor, Stanley Black & Decker. Additional support was also made possible by Bank of America. We have an incredible team here at the New Britain Museum of American Art, and I'd like to take a moment to thank and to acknowledge by name a few who have been instrumental in engineering tonight's event. Lisa Hayes-William, Maura O'Shea, Veronica Zikavarev, and Lisa Lappy. I'm now pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Bob Gregson, who is a tremendously accomplished artist and a dear friend to the NBMAA and has been for many years. Bob received his MFA from the Art Institute of Chicago and worked at the Sidney Jani Gallery in New York, installing exhibitions by Josefs Albers, Claes Oldenburg, Ellsworth Kelly, Marisol, and many others. His own work has been exhibited in Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., as well as throughout the Northeast. In 2014, the New Britain Museum of American Art presented his interactive works in an exhibition entitled Space to Maneuver, and his dynamic sculptural work, Orange Fizz, which is part of the New Britain Museum of American Art's permanent collection, can be viewed year-round in Walnut Hill Park adjacent to the museum. Bob will be speaking for about 40 minutes, after which our associate curator, Lisa Williams, will field questions by email. Thank you and welcome, Bob Gregson.
Okay, let's see how this goes. And
there you are. Nicely done.
Am I there?
You are there.
Okay.
You just want to, Bob, you just want to press that little green button up in the left, remember?
Oh,
and then
yeah,
that way,
here we
yes.
Go. Hey, we did it. Wow.
There it is.
Josef and Anni would be proud of me. Thank you all for coming. And this is so exciting to do a Zoom lecture, which this is all new to all of us, I'm sure. Anni and Josef Albers, I knew about Josefs Albers when I was an art student at Hartford Art School. We had a color course, and the teacher used the interactive color. So that's when I was introduced to Josef, and got to see his work and learn more about the Bauhaus. When I graduated from Hartford Art School, I worked for a gallery in New York, the Sidney Jani Gallery, and the first show that I installed was the Josef Albers show, and that was pretty intimidating. And I had a lot of little square paintings that had to be precisely mounted on the wall, and for a green 22-year-old, that was a very scary prospect, especially when Sidney Jani came out and ordered me to raise them up because they were too low. He said, people are not as short as you and I. I'm 5'8". I didn't think I was short. But the most exciting part of it was at the opening, when the elevator door opened, and there stood Josef Albers and Anni Albers. And Josef walked out with his gray hair and his clear glasses and his gray flannel suit and gray shirt, and Anni had all beiges on. And it was so exciting to actually see them as real people and not just as a myth. It's interesting when you have couples who are artists, like Jackson Pollock or Lee Krasner or Elaine de Kooning, and then you have artists who are collaborators like Charles and Ray Eames, or Christo and Jean-Claude, or Koji van Bruggen and Claes Oldenburg. But what was interesting about Anni and Josef Albers is that they were individual artists. They were innovators and artists and visionaries in their own realm, and we will talk about that as we move along. Josef was born in 1888 in a little mining town in Germany called Bottrop. His father was Lorenz. He was he did decorative painting and did faux finishes. He worked with glass. He did a lot of things that were decorative art related. Josef was actually baptized Franz Josef, and he dropped the Franz along the way, and he also changed the Josef because it was originally PH, and then he made it into an F. So he was already tinkering with his image, I guess, early on. They were Roman Catholic, and Josef always wanted to be a teacher. And so he went to school for teaching and actually got a degree, and for many years was an elementary school teacher until he decided he would follow his passion as an artist. Anni, on the other hand, Anneliese Elsa Fleischmann, was born 11 years later, 1899, in a beautiful town called Schartenberg, Germany. And Josef wasn't poor, but they were very modest income, whereas Anni came from a very wealthy family. Her mother was an heiress for publishing, and also for some reason I read she was a champion tennis player. Her father was a manufacturer, manufactured furniture. So they had a lot of money. They were Jewish. And Anni was, what can I say, rebellious, I guess is the term. She was had her heart set on being an artist. Her father didn't want her to do that, but obviously relented, and she decided to go to art school. Then came the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus originally was started in 1919. It was Walter Gropius, who was a war hero and already an acclaimed architect with buildings that were presented, promoted all over the world. He was asked by the Grand Duke of Weimar to head this School of Arts and Crafts. And Walter Gropius said yes, he would do that, but he would do it only if he had full control. He wanted to reorganize the entire concept of the school. and that he did. He decided, he called it the Bauhaus, and there's never a clear decision as to why it's called the Bauhaus. I see, you know, some books say, oh, it means beautiful house, but in his writings, he talks about the Bau hut. And that's very interesting because those were the shacks, the buildings by the big cathedrals that were being built, that had the stonemasons and the sculptors and the painters and the people who did stained glass, all working together, all the craftsmen working together. And he wanted to create a school that was not a Beaux-Arts school. This is after World War I, and people were thinking in a totally different way. He was addressing the idea of mass production, and he wanted to create objects and things that could be mass produced, but are beautiful and would be of the time. So he changed the whole philosophy of the school, and then so he didn't really have workshops. He had what he called laboratories, and to change the concept of the school as more of a group collaboration, he involved all these great artists, and as you see, despite the fact that they were very interested in having women involved, you have all these guys with their bow ties, but they represent some of the most incredible artists of the time. I mean, you've got Josef Albers over there on the left, and then as you move down, you've got Maholy-Nagy, you've got Herbert Bayer, great graphic designer, you've got Gropius in the center, Marcel Breuer, Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Feininger. You finally have a woman, Gunther Stolz, who's was the weaving department, and Oskar Schlemmer. So they were. That was the school, really. I mean, I think you had ideas and workshops, but they were the school. Paul Klee was a wonderful artist. I mean, in the sense that people loved Paul Klee. When I got to meet Annie a couple of times, and she was, Paul Klee was her hero. And she said that he would cook. He was a great cook. He loved to play the violin. So everyone loved Paul Klee. But Herbert Bayer was the great graphic designer. He changed the whole idea of graphic design and typography and the way photography is used. Of course, Marcel Breuer, the architect who made some great furniture, invented the tubular furniture from his bicycle handlebars. Mies, a great architect, and eventually became the third director of the Bauhaus after it was almost closed forever. Maholy-Nagy, sculptor, did Connecticut sculptures. Zanti Shawinski, who again, graphic designer, very playful, as you can see in his photograph. Oskar Schlemmer, and of course Kandinsky. So you've got these. This is the flavor of these people who taught at the Bauhaus. Now they had workshops, and they had traditional workshops. Some were painting and sculpture, photography. This is a list of all of the things that happened. And but as I say, he thought of it as a laboratory. So you took a little bit of every program, and in order to do this, they even had a different way to present the basic course and the basic course syllabus in a graphic, because it was a whole different way of thinking about education. I always love this picture of Oskar Schlemmer's ballet, and you can see how he was transforming performing arts and using sculpture, and some of these are reproduced and they're on YouTube. you may want to look for them because they're very entertaining and they're very colorful. And when they move, they spin. There's one with tassels in the background. It spins and the tassels fly out. So it's a whole different way of seeing performance art. Now back to Josef. Josef, again, was not wealthy, came to the Bauhaus in 1920, and decided he had to scavenge for his art supplies, and he used glass. The piece on the left here is a more looking piece, but he'd have a light in the back, and he would create these glass pieces, eventually a much more linear type of things. But his first attempts at doing things were these glass pieces. I see at Yale this lovely glass piece where he actually involves sandblasting the glass. So he did a whole series of glass pieces where the glass is etched, and they're very elegant and beautiful pieces. So you see that the Bauhaus was really a lot of, you did a lot of different things. Eventually he took over the furniture workshop after Breuer left, but he did, Josef did furniture, he did metal work with the fruit bowl, he did photography, and the photography is interesting because he would do these collages, and they were really collections of different points of view. So it was really part of his ongoing thoughts about how to see and how to perceive things, and he wanted to try different ways with photography as well. So we have Anni at the Bauhaus, and Anni was very funny. She when I met Anni, and we were talking about her entering the Bauhaus, and she tried 2 attempts. The first attempt she did not get in. The second attempt she did. There were 16 people, and she was one of the 4 people that got in. And she came in, and then she was kind of disappointed that the weaving workshop and the ceramics workshop were, mostly for women. She said the other workshops were a little bit, I guess she didn't want to do them, but she didn't. She felt that weaving was a sissy thing, and that's a quote. She said. So but she decided to do that, and she was very thrilled that she did, because she not only learned the technique of weaving, but had people like Paul Clay come and critique her work, and she says he really affected her the most as far as a teacher goes. And I love these photographs of in art school, because having been in art school, I know that we did some silly photographs, and these were back in the 1920s, and they just remind me of what we would do. Now, the Bauhaus had to move. It left the place in Weimar was they decided to not to close the Bauhaus. I guess it didn't make money, but Dessau quickly jumped in and decided to host the Bauhaus, and not only host the Bauhaus, but gave them money to build the Bauhaus. And what a thrill this was, because you have Walter Gropius, who understood the curriculum since he created it, and he understood the program of the building, and he could design the perfect environment for the Bauhaus. Now this is the classic view of the Bauhaus. This is the workshop area. To the right, you see a little building peeking out in the back. That's the dormitories, the building peeking out. On the left, that's classrooms. In the back are offices and an auditorium. So it's a wonderful complex of buildings and spaces. So it was integrated into the curriculum. And in 1922, that's when Annie went to the Bauhaus, and she met Josef in 1922. And when I talked to her, I my little magazine here that I with the I asked her about meeting Josef, and she said, and I quote her, he was a co-student, an older student, and as in many schools, you have an admiration for older students, sometimes more than the teacher even. And so we gradually met, and I showed him a lot of what I was doing, and we took a walk, and we developed a relationship gradually. And that's a quote from Annie. So she was attracted to him as an older student. And this is them in their, when they were married, and they're in the dormitories with those wonderful Juliet balconies that come out so that people can interact. And if you notice on their balcony, they have a Vasily chair, which is one of the prototypes of Breuer created. So Josef was a student for 3 years and then became a teacher for 10. And that was unusual for the Bauhaus. That really never happened. I think Breuer did something like that, but this was very unusual. Along with the Bauhaus structures, Gropius designed 4 buildings, one for his own home, and then 3 other buildings which had apartments in them for the masters. And they were obviously very austere, very much using the elements of the Bauhaus that were being developed. The upper right is Josef and Annie's apartment. There are those Vasily chairs, those prototypes sitting there on the walls, Josef's work. And there is a funny story, if I can get it correct, that Annie and Josef invited Mies and Lily Reich to dinner, and Annie was making these round butter balls, and Lily says, how funny to have these round butter balls at the Bauhaus. We should have them cut into cubes. And I don't think Annie and Lily were very good friends, but there was a lot of little sniping going on, I think, in those days. As I said, Josef loved to teach, and this was the perfect place for him. He was starting to develop his whole way of teaching. Of course, the Bauhaus was not really about only technique. It was about how you see and think and develop an idea. Annie continued to make wonderful pieces, and she developed these wall hangings so that not only did she have textiles that were useful and practical, like tablecloths or curtains, but she also thought of them as works of art. Well, in 1933, we know that the National Socialists, who did not like degenerate art, decided to close down the Bauhaus. The lower left, you see, those are Bauhaus students protesting. Eventually, they closed it down and made it offices for the Nazis. And in World War II, I guess it was bombed. And eventually, they kind of patched it up and used it as a municipal office in the 40s or 50s before it was restored. And it was a scary time, and everyone left. There was another attempt to open a Bauhaus with the Mies van der Rohe in a factory, an old warehouse or a building, and that didn't last very long. So it was really kind of at its end. Walter Gropius went off to Harvard, became the head of the Harvard School of Architecture, and you've got Mahaly Naj went to Chicago and did the Chicago Bauhaus. And Anni and Josef Albers went to Charlottenburg and went to their apartment and tried to think about what they should do next. Well, what they did next was they had a tea with Philip Johnson, who was in Europe researching international style buildings. And so he visited Anni and Josef in Charlottenburg. And of course, Josef was the director of design for the Museum of Modern Art. And Edward Warburg also worked at the Museum of Modern Art. And he was the from the very wealthy family, financial family. And I did get to thank God for Nick Weber. There many years ago, we went out to lunch with Edward Warburg, and he told very amusing stories. He grew up. His house was the Jewish Museum in New York, and he told some very amusing stories about living in that gigantic museum as a house. But anyway, the point is that Edward Warburg asked Philip that he was working on a new school. They were developing a new school in North Carolina called Black Mountain College, and he asked Philip if he knew any teachers, any art teachers. Well, of course, Philip knew Anni and Josef Albers, and so Anni and Josef were immediately recruited. Eddie Warburg paid for the trip, and Philip did all the paperwork to get them into this country. Well, they went from Germany directly to Black Mountain College, so they really did not see much of America before they got to Asheville, North Carolina in 1934. They thought it was idyllic. They loved it. There's Josef and Anni on the right, Walter Gropius there visiting. And what was interesting about the school, though, is that it was in some ways like the Bauhaus, but the Bauhaus was trying to change the culture that was already entrenched, whereas Black Mountain was trying to develop a whole new culture, an American culture. So this students were, again, very playful, but in the sense of trying to explore new things. But Josef, who became the head of the art department, really took his cues from his Bauhaus experiences. Anni, of course, was the head of the weaving department. Josef did not speak much English, so he had to rely a great deal on his visual presentation to students, and I think that was a very interesting thing, because that also formed his talent as a teacher. As I said, Josef took his cues from, I think, Walter Gropius, and involved incredible people. Merce Cunningham for dance, Bucky Fuller, not Eve Klein, Franz Klein, who was a painter, Ben Shawn, and Robert Motherwell. John Cage came as a musician, Ilya Bolotowski, painter, and of course there was de Kooning, who I was reading in his biography that when he went to, I guess he had a summer to teach at the Black Mountain, and they paid him, I think, $200 plus fare to come down to the college. And he and Elaine had little studios, but Elaine loved so much all of these teachers that she took classes from everybody, and I think only did one piece of artwork during that time. So as you can see, the spirit of the Black Mountain College is very similar to the Bauhaus, although it's in an isolated area, so the students really had to create their own environment and own social life there. Anni did these wonderful pieces at Black Mountain College. These necklaces made of, and you've got box, and you've got this wonderful pull chain, got paper clips, very, very clever. Now, not every student loved Josefs' teaching. Rauschenberg and Inwood felt he was a little bit too dogmatic. Eventually, Rauschenberg talked about how he appreciated Josefs' ideas. But as you can see, there was an entire list of modern artists that became well known throughout the time they were there. Eventually, like the Bauhaus, Black Mountain College moved, and they built a building. Although when I look at this building here in wood, I get nervous about it. But they built a building, and the school, unfortunately, was getting much more traditional and institutional, much to the dismay of the Albers, who kind of lost the infatuation with it. And by 1949, they decided that they should leave. And this was a real transition year for them. They loved Mexico. They had been to Mexico before. So they, in 1949, they took another trip to Mexico. I think they took 14 trips to Mexico throughout their lifetime together. You can see the spirit of the Mexican architecture and design kind of permeates their work. In 1949, Anni had a great moment, a real boost to her career when Philip Johnson asked her to have a one-person show at the Museum of Modern Art. And this was the first show of weaving at the Museum of Modern Art. And this really was a shot in the arm for her, a real boost for her. And it was a traveling exhibition, so she really, this cemented her reputation as a weaver. In between all of this, I mean, during that period, Joseph had to be visiting professor in different places in order to make money. And finally, in 1950, Yale was looking for a new director of the art school, and they wanted to they wanted to hire Joseph because he would shake things up. The art school and the architecture school were really changing. Their philosophy was changing. I mean, they had a Beaux-Arts kind of philosophy before this, and now they wanted an entirely new direction, and so they engaged Joseph to be head of the school. Again, Joseph was a great performer. He, if you can find some videos on YouTube of him teaching, and he looks like he's almost dancing the way he's moving around the classroom, showing ideas and trying to explain concepts. His concepts were very interesting. I mean, he wasn't about teaching painting or drawing. He was about seeing, and not only with color, but as you can see in all sorts of different ways. You know, just by the simple change of the weight of a line can change the way you perceive things. But his great contribution, of course, is the interaction of color. And for those of you who don't know what he was trying to do, well, the one on the left are 4 colors, that he wanted to make into three colors. And the one on the right, he was making 3 colors into 4 colors. And it's just a matter of color in relationship to the background and another color and value and hue. So it was a matter of the way we see and perceive things. At this point, he also started his great homage to the squares. He wanted to create a painting that wasn't about that was about color and not about the design of it. So he wanted to create. He created this format in order to, in some way, present these ideas of how color interacts. If you look at his paintings, you'll see that he does them in a variety of ways, so that the fields of color, some of them are larger, some of them are smaller. So even though you think you've seen them all, you have to look at them again and see how he presented the format of those paintings. So that when you see them, they really were about color. They were about color receding or coming towards you. And the interesting thing about it is that on his paintings, at least, he would write in the back of them all the colors that he would use and the manufacturers. He did not mix colors. He took it directly from the tube, put it on with a palette knife, and then painted. So it is interesting, and the only reason I know this is because I hung that show back when I was a kid. At this point, he was doing a lot of different things, and this is the thing that fascinates me about both Anni and Josef said that they would do a variety of things. Josef did sculpture. This is at the Yale School of Architecture. He did this mural at the Pan Am Building called Manhattan. And it was done in 1963. And in 2000, the Pan Am Building, or the management, took it down, and it ended up in a landfill in Ohio. Well, when I did this last lecture, I talked about that. And Liz Wakus, who's a friend, who's the director of Docomomo, who it's a group that saves mid-century modern architecture, or modern architecture in general, was working with the developer of the Pan Am Building and convinced them to restore it. So there it is again. And I feel like I had a minuscule part in doing that by presenting the piece. So when you're at Grand Central Station and you're wearing your mask, go up the escalator into the building and you'll see the wonderful piece. It's all Formica. Josef did album covers. He did a few other graphics. He worked with an architect, a Yale architect named King Louie Woo, who was a wonderful modernist architect. They were great friends. Families were great friends, and Josef would design things. This is a fireplace he designed for a house in North Haven. He did one in Woodbridge. And one of the things I was reading recently was that the Woo family and the Albers would, I guess they would socialize, and the girls, King Louie Woo's children, would call Josef and Anni Auntie Albers and Uncle Albers, and I kind of like that, and the Josef and Anni kind of like that as well. King Louie Woo designed the Manuscript Building, which was a secret society at Yale, and Josef designed the secret symbol for it. And if you are looking, you can see it, and if I turn it into negative, you see it even better. It was just a secretly put into the mortar of the building. So that was, I like it, secret graphics. Meanwhile, you know, Josef was a busy person. He not only taught at Yale, he taught all over the place, but he had the most incredible students. And Richard Serra, Eva Hess, Richard Anaskevich, Julian Stanzak. These were all students who were becoming wealthy and famous artists, primarily because they had Josef Albers as a teacher. Well, Josef was well known, don't get me wrong, but he was not a superstar, and they were not wealthy. Anni and Josef were not wealthy. Well, finally, the Museum of Modern Art in the mid-60s did a show called The Responsive Eye, which was a lot of op art, and Josef was invited to be part of that, although he didn't think of himself as an op artist, even though he dealt with the relationship of colors. That wasn't for him op art. Anyway, he became quite well known, and also the respected kind of a patriarch of this movement. He was now becoming more and more successful. This was a portfolio of on his interaction of color, so he was able to create this beautiful portfolio, which I don't know how you teach with it because it's so exquisite. It's really more of a work of art. And of course, the Sidney Jani Gallery. This is the show I hung. These were the larger paintings, and but meanwhile, Josef and Anni Anni was also doing things. She was writing books and articles. She wrote a thing on weaving for the Britannica Encyclopedia, and she wrote this book on weaving, and she wrote something on design. So she was doing quite a lot of things, but she was getting older, and weaving, even though she was weaving was getting a little tiresome. Took a long time. And Josef was out doing some prints, and Anni went along and started to explore printmaking. Ironically, too, she was working with this young graduate student. I guess he was a graduate student at the time, I don't know, but Nick Weber, who is now the director of the Albers Foundation, and his family had a printing firm, and Nick actually assisted Anni in trying to explore the idea of printmaking. When I met Anni in the late 1980s, I wanted to buy a print, and I ended up buying a portfolio of prints. And this print on the right was in that portfolio. And she told a very funny story, and I am going to be hit with lightning telling it, but she showed the drawing and the print, and she said, I did this for a psychiatrist. He wanted to use it while he was working. He wanted this as a hooked rug. He wanted a design. So while he was working, he could hook the rug. And he was finished with it, and he called me, and he said, Anni, I'm done with it. Would you like to see it? And she, you know what I said? And I said, no, Anni, what did you say? She said, I said no. And a big grin came on her face. She was a little mischievous story of her. But and I'm sorry, Anni and Josef, for doing that little mimic. But it reminds me so much of that moment that I met her. The other day I went out and I found this house. It's in West Haven, not far from the Yale Bowl. This was a house that the Albers lived in for 20 years, a very modest house. As you can see, there were no plantings right up to the house. There was kind of a stainless steel handrails, which I would assume King Louie Woo must have designed. Everything was painted white, even the shutters. So this was the house that so much of that wonderful artwork came from. Eventually, as I say, the Albers did make some money, and they decided to move on, and they moved to a raised ranch. And they loved the idea of this being a vernacular, an American, no-nonsense kind of environment. And as you can see, again, no plantings, stainless steel handrails. And as you walk in that front door and up the staircase, you would come into the living room, which was totally white. Actually, the kitchen was totally white, white formica, white the linoleum. Annie was very proud of these sofas that she said she got from Bloomingdale's. The only color in the house were two paintings on one side and two paintings on the other of Josef's work. They did treat themselves, though. If you look in the background, way in the background of this, there's a little car. It's a Mercedes, a green Mercedes, and that was their treat because they loved to drive. And this figures into their, I'll explain that a little bit in a minute. Look at that. There are those prototype Vasily chairs that we saw way back years and years ago, and they were still with Annie and Josef as they got older. Annie's bedroom was on the top, and it was a typical ranch house, you know, with the bedrooms. She went to a office supply place for cabinetry, and her bedroom, the one photo on the bottom is her bedroom in the Bauhaus. And if you look on the little shelf in the corner, there is a tiny little figurine. And if you look up on the upper left corner here, there is that same figurine, which was given to her by Josef many, many years ago when they first knew each other. And it's very sweet that stayed with her all these years. Well, Annie and Josef were famous, humble but famous, and other people would come to visit them in their raised ranch and their other house. Lord Stone took pictures. Maximilian Schell was a great friend of Annie's and collected her work. Henry Geldzeller, who was the curator for contemporary art at the Met, came. Jackie Kennedy Onassis visited, and many, many other celebrities would come and seek Annie out and Josef out. As a matter of fact, I think Maximilian Schell did a film on Marlene Dietrich, and there is a little part where I think Annie speaks, and she gets a credit in the film. So she's not only an artist now; she's an actress. In 1976, Josef dies, 88 years old, and Annie's left to really address his legacy. And she was quite busy in her later years. She got honorary doctorate degrees. She had a show at the Renwick Gallery in Washington, which was a traveling show, the Brooklyn Museum. She was there to open the Albers Museum in Bottrop. So she was very, very busy. And, you know, there was much more material written about her and published about her. So she really came into her own, almost like a late bloomer, or we were late bloomers in appreciating her because she was there all the time. In 1971, the Albers Foundation was created while Josef was alive, and they bought property in Bethany, and Tim Prentice, who was a student of Josef and Annie, of Josef, designed the foundation, and it was opened after, I guess, Annie died. And that, on the bottom, you'll see Annie and her two siblings. And Hans was I think lived in Connecticut. And I think this was paid for by reparations from the war, because they were a very wealthy family, and I think they lost a great deal of their money in the war, in World War II. That person standing there in the gallery is Nicolas Fox Weber, who has been their guy attending their legacy all these years. Great writer and a wonderful person. So Annie and Josef are buried in Orange, only about a mile away from where I'm sitting. I love the fact that they each have their own stones. They don't share a stone. They're very much strong individuals on their own. And if you notice, the stones are facing actually the driveway. If you look back, the other stones are going in this direction towards the street, and these are this way. And the story goes that they wanted to, if one of them died, they wanted to drive their car and go to the post road and shop or get the mail, and they could come by and visit without having to get out of their car, which I think is a very sweet idea. Now, before I leave you, I have one more thing to read, which I think is really quite lovely, and this is verbatim because I did have it recorded. This is what Annie said when one of the times I first met her. She says, I've never called myself an artist. Josef and I always felt that art is something you are aiming at, but you aren't an artist because of that. You do your work, whatever it is. And so he called himself a painter, and I called myself a weaver, but we never called ourselves artists. We thought that belonged to the gods. So that is my story of Anni and Josef Albers, and I guess we have to see how we do this. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer anything I possibly can. And thank you for all being here and listening, putting up with me. Okay, what do we do next?
Thank you so much, Bob. I think at this point, well, maybe you can leave your screen up, actually. I was going to have you minimize it, but I think it's kind of nice to see the images. Thank you, Bob, for so generously sharing your insights into the lives and work of Anni and Josef Albers. It's especially fascinating to see these wonderful historic photographs that you've put together for us. So thank you so much. My name is Lisa Williams. I'm the Associate Curator at the New Britain Museum of American Art. We have time for one question. And Bob, as your work is in the collection of the New Britain Museum of American Art, I think it'd be especially interesting to hear whether you feel your own work has been inspired by that of Josef and Albers, and if so, how?
Well, it's interesting because he was all about seeing and process. And if you, for any of you who have been to the museum and did get to see my sculpture there, it is a series of panels that with circles drilled through it. And again, it's all about points of view and visual things. But the other interesting thing about it, and I don't think of myself as a colorist, but I do think of I do like the idea of color. And one side is bright orange, the other side is white. And when the sun hits the orange side, it reflects back on the panels. So you get this glow of orange. So I think those probably was an influence. Although I think, as I said, I think his whole process, his whole thought process was something that influenced me and how I do my work.
Fascinating. I hope that everybody tuning in right now takes the opportunity to visit Bob's sculpture, which is located in Walnut Hill Park. It's part of the New Britain Museum of American Art's collection. And it's on view year round. You can't miss it. It's bright orange. And I do think it demonstrates a clear interest in that bold interplay of color and geometry that we also see in the work of Josef and Anni. So we're so grateful to be able to display that proudly. So I think that we'll wrap up with that. But before we close, I want to thank you one last time, Bob. This has really been a delight. And I also want to encourage everyone to visit the New Britain Museum of American Art's website for information regarding more enriching online programs related to our exhibition In Thread and on Paper, Anni Albers in Connecticut, including a forthcoming color class led by exhibition curator Fritz Horstman and presented by the Glass House, and that's coming up on Friday, May 22nd, so mark your calendars. We'll also be offering a lecture entitled Experiments by Fritz Horstman and Carice Medina, who is the associate curator at the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation, and that will launch on Thursday, May 28th. So we so enjoyed tonight, and we have much more coming in the pipeline related to the show. Many wonderful learning opportunities around the work of Anni and Josef Albers, two artists who we admire and celebrate so much. So with that, we thank you all and wish you a good evening and hope to see you again soon.
I want to thank all my friends and whoever came to listen to me. I do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Good night, all.